Hello. Please watch this World War II video in combination with the World War II handout. And while you go through those two resources, please just be also filling out answers to the World War II quiz as you go along. So, the first page here of the World War II handout is about the liberal policy of appeasement, the liberal powers of France and Britain giving in to the fascist powers. We had talked about the Treaty of Versailles being the worst of both possible worlds, enough to anger Germany and Italy, uh, but not enough to permanently take away their ability to make war. And the liberal powers down the road, now we're here in the 1930s, unwilling to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, which had deeply angered especially Germany, but also Italy as well. So you can read some more about that, and there'll be a few quiz questions about that. We are going to turn here to page 2 of World War II handout in terms of the nature of warfare and how World War II is different than World War I. Then we're going to talk just a little bit about the Holocaust and a little bit about the kind of ebb and flow of World War II and the way it played out and some of the significances. The nature of warfare in World War I versus World War II. A big part of this then is the way the war is conducted was very different. World War One was a defensive war on the Western Front, two sides digging in against each other in trenches and just trying to bleed each other to death. What this slide here is attempting to show is World War II was a very offensive, mobile, highly mobile offensive war. Germany perfects this new strategy of modern warfare called the Blitzkrieg, known as the Lightning War, where they're trying to mobilize a decisive force against the enemy line and have a decisive breakthrough against the enemy line so as to secure rapid, total victories against the enemy. So the technology of war making had changed dramatically in the 20 years between the end of World War One and the beginning of World War Two. Now you have tanks, you have bomber aircraft, etc. All this lends itself to new strategies and an entirely new environment of modern warfare in World War Two compared to World War One. Highly offensive and mobile warfare. The other major difference in terms of the conduct is because now warfare becomes much more mobile, you also have a lot more civilian casualties. And you can see the destructive capacity of the technology in general. World War I, 10 million dead, total civilizational disaster. World War II is going to leave 51 million people dead. So you see the destructive capacity of the technology ratcheting up. Also, the strategy changes. Both of these are total wars. A total war means that the entire society is mobilized behind the war effort. Every human resource, every material resource is geared towards victory in the war. Well, increasingly, the strategy becomes then with this highly mobile offensive warfare, especially with bomber aircraft, well, what if we can take out some of the human resource? So they start bombing major metropolitan areas. The fascists, the Axis powers will do this first, but the Allied powers, this will be a standard part of their playbook as well. The intentional targeting of civilian population centers to knock out the industrial capacity. In World War One, people working away on the home front in the factories, they were never personally endangered by the war. In World War Two, these attacks will be carried out against cities and major industrial cities in order to hamper the war effort of the opposition, of the opposing side. So the intentional targeting of civilians becomes a major part of the strategy, and you can see more civilian than military deaths occur in World War II. Now, yes, you do have the Holocaust wrapped into this as well, of course, adding tremendously to the civilian death total. But nonetheless, this is also a factor regarding the way the war strategy is carried out, and as a result of the technology. Okay, let's now speak to the Holocaust here briefly in our studies. And just read along with me here for 1 second. The Holocaust. This was the as the Nazis put it, the final solution to the Jewish question. Led to the industrialized mass murder of 6 out of the 9 million Jews living in Europe. So, 2 out of every 3 Jews living in Europe in the 1930s and into the 1940s are systematically murdered by Nazi Germany. What we're talking about is industrialized murder, murder on an industrial scale. And there's a lot of different ways to think about the Holocaust and consider the Holocaust. There are obviously entire museums, entire high school and university courses geared towards Holocaust studies. But on just the most basic level, other than the horrid inhumanity, the Holocaust is murder on an industrial scale. They apply the capacity of industrialization from the railroads in order to concentrate people in the concentration camps, to the poison gas they use to gas people in the showers, to the incineration process of the murdered individuals, etc. This was murder on an industrial scale. You would not have been able to do something like this in a pre-industrial capacity. They harness the incredible capacity of industrialization, but they apply it towards mass murder. Another thing to consider here is the peoples who were targeted by the Nazi regime that were not Jewish. Now, the Jews were easily the group singly targeted for the greatest degree of destruction by the Nazis. But there are a lot of other groups as well that were killed in the Holocaust. So Slavs, Roma, the disabled, intellectuals. These were intellectual adversaries to fascism or Nazism, and homosexuals also targeted for murder by the Nazi regime. So you have an additional 7 million individuals made up of these different groups killed in the Holocaust, for a rough total of 13 million individuals killed over the course of about a 7-year time period. This quote from Primo Levi, who's a Holocaust survivor, I think is an important one as we consider the grave inhumanity that the Holocaust represents. We must remember, Levy says, that these faithful followers, among them the diligent executors of inhuman orders, were not born torturers, were not, with a few exceptions, monsters. They were ordinary men. Monsters exist, but they're too few in number to be dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe without asking questions. The ordinary people of the Nazi regime, or collaborators with the Nazi regime, Levy says, you're not going to be able to carry out the murder of, let's say, roughly 2 million, 1.5 million people a year without a lot of people being involved. Monsters exist. He's referring, of course, to Adolf Hitler and a number of leaders in the Nazi Party, but they're too few in number to be truly, truly dangerous. What's really dangerous, Levy says, is ordinary people carrying out inhumane orders. It's the ordinary people who carry this out. You would never have been able to have this level of genocidal behavior without a lot of people contributing to carrying it out. Okay, and then let's shift to a quick overview of World War II. We'll just get a little sense of the two opposing sides in World War II and a little bit of an ebb and flow of the battle. This war pitted the Allies versus the Axis powers. The Axis powers were fascist, and World War II was an ideological war. The Allies were secular humanists, liberal, liberalism, the liberal powers of Britain, France, and by 1941, the United States of America, or socialist Marxists, the USSR, communist Russia. The Axis powers were fascists. So this is an ideological war. It breaks down along the lines of the secular humanists versus the fascists, essentially, is the way it ultimately breaks down. Okay, and then we have these different sets of dates. So I'll just talk over a little bit regarding these. Uh, Stalin was very nervous about the impending German threat under Hitler. So in 1939, he signs a pact that says the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are not going to fight each other for 10 years. It's just a non-aggression pact. Both sides pledge to not attack each other for 10 years. So what this allows is for Hitler to invade into Poland, and let's take a look at the map here. And the Soviet Union's not going to get involved. In fact, the Soviet Union is going to take the eastern half of Poland. So Germany, Nazi Germany, and the USSR, Communist Russia, are just going to swallow Poland. And then, with the invasion of Germany into Poland, this is going to bring Britain and France into the war. Britain and France had appeased Nazi Germany to a great degree. Their red line was Poland. So once Germany invades into Poland, World War II begins. What the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany allows for Hitler, he can now fight a one-front war. The war is on, but he only has to fight on the Western Front over here, having signed this non-aggression pact with Stalin to the east. So what this allows for then is a quick succession of Nazi victories to the west. You can see here in 1940, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France itself occupied in 6 weeks. France gets absolutely rolled in this war, as Germany now only has to fight a one-front war. Having taken over the East, we can see this here. Hitler's able to take over the entire East. Then Britain stands all alone by 1940. And being an island nation, it is able to defend itself from a large-scale invasion. But you can see here in 1940, the Germans are invading into British airspace and able to bomb civilian population centers on the ground. This was known as the Blitz in in Britain, at the hands of the Germans. Hitler's hoping that through air raids and bombing British population centers, he'll be able to weaken Britain to the degree to which he might be able to invade into Britain. That is unsuccessful, so Hitler just kind of puts those plans on hold and turns his attention eastward, so Britain is able to hold out. And that will be important later. Now, what you've got then is here in this set of documents here, Hitler, having conquered all the territory he possibly can to the west, is now going to turn his attention eastward towards a massive invasion into the Soviet Union. And that's kind of best described here. First, Hitler takes over Western Europe. Now he's going to extend German control eastward and this massive invasion into the Soviet Union. In the process of doing so, of course, he's breaking the non-aggression pact that he had signed with Stalin just 2 years earlier, excuse me. So 1941 is a big turning point in the war because the Russians are able to hold eventually. And you can see the Germans extend into the Soviet Union to a great degree here at the expense of enormous losses of life. The Russians are able to hold, and then they're going to start to push the Germans back from east to west, back towards Berlin. December 7th, 1941, Japan pulls a surprise attack on the United States naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This is going to bring the United States into the war. It's also going to lead Hitler to declare war on the United States. The United States will then mobilize for war by 1941 and be involved in both theaters of the war, both the Pacific in Asia and the Asian theater in the Pacific, and in Europe as well. 1943, you have the major tipping point towards German defeat. The major battle of Stalingrad here in 1943, they're able to hold, and they're going to push then from that point forward in 1943. They're going to start pushing back. Here's the Battle of Stalingrad. They're going to start pushing back east to west towards Germany. So Stalin's forces of the Soviet Union are going to be slowly, over a 2 year time period, pushing the Germans back towards Germany from east to west. Eventually, they'll be the first to arrive in Berlin. The Allies are going to start to be able to bomb German population centers in 1943, in March of 1943. And in 1944, June of 1944, the Brits and the Americans are able to open up a second front against Germany with the invasion of the beaches of Normandy, the D-Day invasion, to start to liberate Western Europe. So what you have then are the Russians are coming from the east, the Brits and the Americans are coming from the west and from the south as well. And the tide has most definitely turned against Germany in World War II. Like I said, the Russians arrive first in Berlin. This is effectively the end of World War II in Europe. Just days before the end, just looking at this last set here, then, just days before the end of World War II in Europe, Hitler commits suicide in an underground bunker as the Red Army of the Soviet Union is fighting street to street in Berlin and ultimately taking over the capital city. The Soviets take Berlin. Germany surrenders to end the war in Europe. The war in the Pacific, in Asia, against the Japanese will continue on for some months into 1945. The war will ultimately end with the Americans carrying out the atomic bombings of the two Japanese cities, first of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and then of Nagasaki on August 9th. What you have then is World War II is over, and this tremendous human calamity comes to an end. But what you have then is the introduction now of humanity into an atomic era, which are degrees of destructive technological and scientific capacity way beyond anything that had been applied throughout most of World War II, except at the very end. This graph is rather interesting in terms of it speaks to the loss of life and both military and civilian in World War II, and it's broken down by country. I just want to highlight the experience of the Soviet Union in terms of what that society sacrificed for the defeat of Nazi Germany. You can see here, these are the total number of deaths. The estimates are around 24 million deaths. And then the blue bar graph for each society is the percentage of the population killed. So in order to sustain this invasion and to repulse it, the Soviet Union loses somewhere around 13 to 14% of its overall population and close to 24 million of its own people. This is what we're talking about, the tragic irony of Stalin's rapid, brutal industrialization process. Without that industrialization process, the Soviet Union would have never been in a position to have held up under such a dramatic Nazi invasion of 2 million soldiers. So you just have these terrible tragedies piled on top of each other in the context of the first half of the 20th century. Here you can see the relative experience of the United States, and this is in no way to diminish the sacrifice and the courage of the American military in World War II. Obviously, it was a critical component. But you can see here's Britain, here's France, here's the United States. You can this just gives you a little bit of a sense of how different the reality was for the Soviet Union and what a huge role the Soviet Union played in the defeat of Nazism.